Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Sports Tech Allstars Podcast. We're back in 2025, our first episode kicking off our focus on a new market. Well, not so new. It is the market I'm originally from, the Indian SportsTech ecosystem, a story that we've been talking about for a while. It is one of the fastest growing sports innovation markets in the world. It is one of the fastest growing sports markets in the world, a country that is awakening to sports beyond cricket. We're going to be launching our first Indian-focused sports and business tech report end of January, early February, I believe, pretty soon. Stay tuned for that. Be on our newsletter to be notified when it's out. And because of that, we're focusing our podcast for the next month on the Indian market. And I'm glad to invite as the first guest of the series and the year on the podcast, as somebody that I've known for a while, and sports enthusiast, a sports lawyer, Nandan Kamath. Welcome to the show, Nandan.
Thank you so much, Ron. Actually, before I was a sports lawyer, I've been a tech lawyer for even longer. So great overlap, and thanks for having me on the show.
So perfect person to have on the show. Now that I know you wear many hats, so rather than butchering your introduction, I will let you do it yourself. What are these various hats that you wear?
Yeah, I mean, it's a bunch of hats. I used to be an athlete, played cricket at the junior level, have worked in sports law for a while now, almost 20 years in India, and I run a couple of non-profits working with athletes and also working on sports policy around increasing rates of physical activity and sport in the population. So a bunch of different things, exploring interests, exploring my own skills, all of them bound by sport.
And in fact, we can do a little plug for a report that you published around this time last year, if I'm not mistaken. That's when we reconnected. Nandan and I actually share an alma mater, if I remember correctly, in Bangalore, which is where we're originally from. We went to the same school a few years apart. But yeah, you did a report on this, speaking about increasing physical activity in, let's say, the Indian population. Maybe you want to do a quick word about that?
Yeah, it was a report done with Dalberg Advisors and our organization, the Sports and Society Accelerator, talking about the state of sport and physical activity. So just looking at patterns around how many people are getting adequate physical activity, what the barriers are, and in some sense, what we can do about that. So quite a foundational report looking at data from 4 different states, but looking at trends that emerge from there. And I think that's a important starting point if you're to build a sports culture, but also just a sports industry in many different ways. So lots of interesting trends to take from there.
Yeah, I'm sure we will maybe talk about that and the key takeaways from that report. But Nandan, prolific as he is, you've also written a book. Maybe a little word on that as well.
Yeah, so this is a book that came out last year, March 2024, called Boundary Lab. It's an exploration of the role of sport in society. It has some bits around tech and privacy and other aspects, but much wider scope, just bringing all of my different interests together of sports commerce, sports tech, just the understanding of what role sports plays in society. So a little bit of a deep exploration. I really enjoyed putting it together over the last 3-4 years and bringing it to fruition.
So maybe let's start there. As somebody who's been in the sports ecosystem for such a long time, obviously in different roles and different hats, as an athlete, on the legal, maybe policy side, as a contributor from the tech perspective and innovation perspective, what has been, let's say, the biggest evolution or the biggest change? Have you seen a ramp up of interest? And we'll come to the cultural side in a second, because I think that is so crucial to drive that change long term. But just from, let's say, the business of sport, or just how much it's talked about, let's say, in the corridors of offices in Delhi in the government, or even the business offices around India.
Yeah, I've been at it now for almost 20 years, and I would say see change in the position for sport in conversations around even just nationhood, let alone office conversations. So it's become very front end at the level of sort of very senior, not just government officials, but also politicians, understanding the power that sport has in building that nation, but also in diplomacy, in the position India takes in the world, but also what it can deliver to its own populations. Not just a sport as an end in itself. I mean, great to win medals, great to win and bids to host major events. Perhaps we'll host the Olympics at some point. But also what sport can do socio-economically for the population as a whole. And I think that's the trend that's been the most exciting, sort of looking at sport as people's movement, cultural shifts. I know we'll talk a bit more about that, but just positionality of sport, significant changes in 2 decades. And I think it's a pleasure to see that and have played some role in that too.
Maybe we can get into the cultural aspect straight away, because I think this is really what's driving that change and that social acceptance of that, hey, sports, you can make a career in sports. I think that's a big part of that is parents in India who have been probably just, very old school, career focused, get a good job, beta, beti, and make a life out of it. And sports maybe or sport, art, dance, all the cultural endeavors are not what an average Indian parent would consider a place to make a career. But that shift has happened, right? And maybe you've seen that the opportunities opening up, starting perhaps with the cricket at the IPL, and how you don't have to play for India to make a good life in sport. You could be playing for a decent club team or a T20 team, which was not the case maybe when you and I were growing up, that if you didn't make it to India, you didn't really have much of a career. Has that been the biggest driving change? That there is a bigger socio-economic opportunity that sports gives Indians today?
Yeah, Ron, I'd say that I think we are driven certainly by achievement and celebrityhood, but the change in sport and role of sport careers in sort of evolving notions of what's worth doing has not happened alone, right? It's not happened in a vacuum. Lots has changed around it. I mean, sport is the ultimate entrepreneurship. I mean, you're investing in yourself. There's nothing else that you're investing in, your own talents. Lots of front-end investment for perhaps deferred compensation, high risk. Things could get derailed. It's not only entrepreneurial, but it's also this notion of freelance, right? You go to opportunities, plug in, plug out. And lots of the concept of work has changed around us as well over the last 10 or 15 years. Many more work from anywhere, freelancing, but also the spirit of entrepreneurship has, I think, embedded in our culture a lot more, I would say, over the last decade. And that has cultural impacts on willingness to take risks, attitudes to what careers can be. And I think we've seen successful cricket careers and a whole generation of that, some of that seeping into other sports while economies continue to grow there.
Great point. Actually, I hadn't thought of it that way or had heard it articulated in that way. But there is this young India which is backing itself, essentially.
Yes.
And being on that front foot and saying, hey, let's give this a good go. Let's say maybe that is an important factor, the socio-economic, or let's say the economic opportunities. Anything else you want to talk about which is changing a cultural mindset? Maybe it's just the attention that young people, not just Indians, are all paying on, not just young and old, but people today are paying to their bodies, just their own health and fitness. And that is an important thing, that doing sport is an important part of that.
Oh, absolutely. I think we've had a very unique relationship with our bodies. There's been a high prioritization of, I would say, efforts of the mind, with the body really being packaging for the mind. And I think that has taken a significant shift, right? So we are seeing people with much higher awareness of the role of health in their life, the importance of, I would say, the longevity movement, but not just the number of years, but the number of quality years you live today. Much more understanding of that in certain aspects and certain places in the population. Now, seeping that down at a population scale hasn't happened yet. And I think that's where some of our research around and advocacy around everyone getting adequate physical activities starting to take some root, starting to have some impact as well. So while I would say there are green shoots of awareness of why it's important to be active and healthy, I don't think that is seeped into the day-to-day yet, but the conversations are certainly beginning.
And maybe this is a good time to bring up the key findings from the report that you did, the state of play in India, because we usually have this urban bias. Let's say people that I know, my friends, yeah, of course, everybody is more conscious and on diets and doing some sort of sport or fitness regime. But to your point, maybe it's not as pervasive as we think. Maybe these were some of the findings that you had, and maybe you can talk about what your report uncovered.
Yeah, so I mean, it's a lot of data that was some new, some affirmed what the WHO has looked at India and understood, which is at least at the adolescent level, 3/4 of India is getting inadequate physical activity. So most of our youngsters, 3 in 4, aren't moving enough on a weekly basis. And even adults, it's in the 40-50% rates between men and women. There are large gender gaps evolving, and those gender gaps evolve at age 14, 15 and stay for life. So it's very significant interventions needed with adolescent girls in particular. And just the sort of the desire and the skills, but also the opportunities to exercise, to be active, I think are significant constraints. Many people talk about their desire to be active, but they face significant constraints, which could be social constraints, it could be physical constraints, it could be issues like safety. And I think our work is trying to address them head on and also trying to find perhaps solutions which might be programmatic. They might be even technological. And I think that's where some of the opportunities lie for sports tech as well, which I'd love to chat more about.
Yeah, let's get into that. But before we get into sports tech, I want to talk about just to finish the cultural conversation, now we've talked about some of the challenges that we have in the Indian economy, some great points that you bring up from a policy perspective, because you are a policy driver and you work in this environment. Before we come to the tech side, what have you seen from that side, which is trying to affect this change?
So, to me, the most interesting aspect is actually pulling out of what you talked about, sports careers, but not just careers as athletes. To me, the big drive is going to come from actually the RAP careers, what I call sports allied careers. And if you look at the significant sports economies of the world, you see 2-3% of the working population working in sports and fitness allied activities. So jobs in and around sport, while we are very not even close to 1% of our population is in those types of jobs. So I do think the economy of sport, with knock-on effects on livelihoods and the socio-economic impact that economies of sport bring, is going to play a very crucial role. So essentially sports tourism, sports manufacturing, sort of the harder sort of physical jobs of sport actually have to lead, while a lot of the other things will build on that. To me, these are the fundamental building blocks of how do we generate enough jobs driven by demand, not just jobs for jobs' sakes, but how do the sort of the micro economies of sports start getting activated? And to me, as someone working in sports policy, most people would think you're talking about how do you get more medals. But this is actually the fundamental, when you talk about grassroots of sport, this is the area where I think most sports policy is going to be focused around, is sports jobs, sports economies, and in some sense, demand-driven generation of these economies.
I think maybe this is a decent segue question. I don't know about to characterize my own podcast, but to get to the tech side of things, because the job creation that you're talking about and all the various aspects, and you mentioned earlier in the conversation about the potential of hosting an Olympics, and this is a mega event. How much of that do you see is driven by public policy, or how much do you see actually, hey, these are the private guys and they're going to be the ones, and private office and business is going to be the ones that are driving this next wave of, whether it's job creation, whether it's winning medals, this next wave of sports-related empowerment in India?
Yeah, so there is this model, right, in India of Samaj Sarkar Bazaar, and to translate that, it's essentially civil society, government and business having to come together, markets coming together in this sort of three-sided model, which everyone figures out their role and participates in different I would say constructive ways. To me, I would love to see the government less in delivery mode, much more in regulatory and policy mode, which is essentially more like team manager rather than captain. So you're not sort of there on the field trying to direct action, but you're there in some sense shaping the way the sports ecosystem is to evolve. We've had a very strong government-supported push for sport, but it's also been in implementation mode. While I think many of the other actors who should be putting their hands up, whether it's corporate India, whether it's the federations, whether it's the state governments, I think everyone has a role in a much larger ecosystem, but it has to make sense. So the incentives have to be right. The right people need to be controlling these, but also with clarity on what contribution they can make to the larger whole. So I think sports policy there helps to align roles, but also set the right incentives, which I don't think we've done yet. So why should a sport be supported in a state? Why should a federation have good governance guidelines? I mean, we have them at a principal level, but what is the benefit you get? And I think that clarity needs to come from government. I wouldn't say instructions, but just the beaconing role that a government could play. And then it's in some sense shaping the ecosystem to evolve and respond to demand, supply, and grow in I would say an organic way, which is far from what we've done so far in that sense.
I like the manager, not captain line, and then hitting it out of the park with his analogies today. Brilliant stuff. And I think, and I agree completely, India is the country too big to have a top-down approach. You need everybody to be pulling their weight societally and the market's perspective. And let's get to that, because tech innovation is a big part of how business will operate today and how sport will reach a wide audience. What for you are the big opportunities and challenges, of course, when looking at the sports tech market in India?
Yeah, so I think tech has an incredibly important role in the next phase. So I think we've been very focused on bridging gaps, and I think tech we've not used to the extent that we can. One, just to build trust in the market, everyone knowing their role, talking to each other, communication flowing better through the system, better use of resources. So it's a very fundamental use of tech for better communication. But then if you overlay different aspects and what tech can bring, it's actually bridging massive gaps in the same way that maybe wireless communications bridged gaps. I mean, earlier to get a telephone in your home was a massive issue maybe 30, 40 years ago. But the way technology bridged and helped us to leapfrog, be competitive in the world of information technology, I think that there is that possibility in the world of sport to actually bridge knowledge gaps, to bridge coaching gaps, and to really build that participative aspect of the ecosystem where many people perhaps do not have guidance, do not have the ability to build personalized programs. But maybe tech is going to be that bridge over the next 15, 20 years as AI develops, there's a mix between coaching knowledge as well as tech delivery. So I see it from a very participative angle, but also bringing new things to high-performance sport, because that's also going to lead in many ways. And then in between that, just connecting either high-performance or participation with fan engagement. And I see sports tech in those three compartments, really: high-performance, participative sport, and the bridging role that fan engagement is going to play. And I think we cannot ignore any of those if you want to build a healthy ecosystem. There's going to need investment, but also, I would say, localization to understand what India needs and to meet the market. You see a lot of innovation around, okay, is capable of this, but does the Indian market need this? I think asking the more fundamental questions, and that's where, to me, the research muscle becomes hugely important. So we need a much more understanding at a research level of how the Indian market works, what the gaps are, the needs are, and I would love to see a slightly more academic research orientation to how tech is able to deliver on the places where there are leverage opportunities to catch up and then to perhaps exceed global standards.
And I think India has traditionally been very good at that, which is X and Y works in those markets. How do we adapt it? So it's not just copy-paste mergers, but seeing a solution out there, adapting it to the Indian environment, because it has to be localized. India is very unique. It's just by its size, its diversity, etc. So how does it work in an Indian context? And there are many different types of solutions. You mentioned three important areas. The pro side of things, where you've got a couple of very mature leagues, let's say one really mature league, which is international standard, international up there with whatever benchmark you set, and then everything else is a big gap. On the participative side, maybe on the urban side, you're seeing a good change, but again, big gap. So this, and then on the fan engagement side, where I think there is just a big gap. I don't think there is a top line there as already. So these three areas are crucial. Are there any specific technologies that you see or specific opportunities, whether it's around broadcasting tech or mass participation of fans or youth sports or anything like that you see out there in the market that you say, hey, we can hang our hat on that? The reason I ask is, like, for example, fantasy sports. We've seen that as being the breakout, let's say, sports tech related topic. At least it's considered sports tech everywhere else in the world. In India, I don't know, for whatever reason, they get a bit of a mixed bag of response. But fantasy is broken out, and that is, let's say, the poster child of Indian sports tech today. What do you think is going to be that next breakthrough topic?
Yeah, I mean, great question. I can't say I have all the answers for it, but I would love to see more attention on personalized coaching. So where fundamental skills are actually become the wrappers, but then you have personalization, specific sports, getting kids used to playing many wider array of sports, bringing it even to the home, right? The sampling becomes easy for a parent to actually participate in their child's progress. Right now, we have a very structured environment where there's very little unstructured play in the home, around places to play. I mean, all of us grew up playing on the streets. A lot of those opportunities have changed through rapid urbanization. Much of the play now happens in very structured environments of academies, not the most efficient places to learn. So I would like to see coaching time really unlocked for a larger number of people. And I think tech will replace that 1:20 coaching atmosphere, have all 20 spend that 1 hour really well in an academy or even offline in homes and other locations which are easier to get to. Travel time is a huge gap. I mean, most people for a 1 hour session end up spending 2.5 hours often to and fro and all of the other things that go around that. So better use of time, but also delivery of knowledge and skills in a much more personalized way is something I'm quite excited about.
I think a good example again of what you talked about earlier, where government can drive policy about how do we develop new coaches and how do we create more opportunities for certain categories of employment to be created, and then it's on the private side to kind of deliver it and see how we can, or even the government might do a little bit of infrastructure with defining policy, but then it's on the private side to deliver that infrastructure to the masses. I think, yeah, the coaching or anything youth sports related, I'm always excited by. We talk about solutions and solution drivers. Of course, the Indian startup ecosystem is something that you have to talk about in the sports tech startup ecosystem. We've mentioned a little bit about the big guys in the fantasy sports. How do you, perhaps either yourself or through your organizations, or just generally see the startup collaboration between, let's say, the limited pro sports atmosphere, or whatever you want to call it, the market in India, versus this wide, audience of either participation, either people who are doing sports or can participate as fans. There's a small pro sports segment, but wide market. And these startups have to operate somewhere in between. Either how do you create or collaborate with startups yourselves, or how do you just see startups fitting into this kind of unstable, maybe it's the wrong word, but just an ecosystem which is in flux a bit?
That's a great question, Rohan, because we work with lots of startups in multiple different capacities as lawyers, as sort of people working in participative sport, but also high performance sport with the Go Sports Foundation trying to deliver this. Now, none of the providers we see are finding it easy to find their product market fit simply from, there are needs, but is someone willing to pay for it? And is that possible to scale at high performance levels? Extremely challenging, because if let's say you build a product for badminton coaching, it's the second largest participative sport in the country. But can you get people to pay for a coaching product? Can you get people to, in some sense, that extra 5%, is there someone willing to pay? People have tried school sports models. Now, very difficult to get someone to pay even like $1 per month extra additional to school fees. So there are some very unique struggles. Even if you're able to deliver value, commercializing sports tech has been a massive challenge so far. Either the market is too small and very specific, or it is so dissipated that the value of sports tech hasn't landed in the places where there is real value to be generated. So I think it's seen as a facilitator. A lot of our tech usage, whether it's content and other things, is often free. So there's also a notion that tech is a free layer which is meant to get you to somewhere at low cost. So that overall willingness, not just in a sports context, to pay for tech is also quite limited. Quite a few headwinds, but I think there's examples like you mentioned, fantasy, able to break through, find that product market fit, but also scale at the right time, scale with the right incentives, and bring more people into that. And the knock-on effects we see on broadcast viewing and other things, they found, I would say, the right alliances at the right times, either directly or even not directly.
Yeah, so
I think,
course.
I think finding allies is quite important for tech players. So very difficult to play that game alone. I think riding whatever tailwinds you have, finding friends and working together to grow together would be a pretty significant insight I have in terms of the ones that are successful. The ones that go it alone are really struggling to commercialize, I'd say, at this stage.
Yeah, things have to come together. I think maybe fantasy was just that perfect melting pot of moments. The Indian team was in a certain way. The market is picking up. I think mainly you talked about incentive alignment. They had a clear incentive that they could provide to their fans. It was monetary, but whatever the case may be, it drives engagement and enjoyment into sport, and it brings money into sport and creates a lot of employment in sports-related jobs as well. So a lot of benefits when you find that perfect fit. We've talked a lot about the participative side. A little bit you've touched on the fan engagement side. What do you think is the biggest challenge? Why is the average Indian fan just not really willing to pay? Is it, again, just a perception of the value that they give for sports? Also, when I say not willing to pay, Indians pay top dollar to get into a stadium, and really premium prices when the event is of the right magnitude. So the wallet share is there, and when they perceive the value, they will go in and engage with it. But yeah, they won't pay for a fantasy app or sorry, not a fantasy app, but maybe not a fan engagement app, or different ways. Is it just that this product market fit comes from the right communication, the right context setting, or is there something bigger in place?
No, I wonder about that because you're willing to pay whatever 40,000 rupees for a IPL ticket, but you're not willing to pay 10 rupees a day for a subscription. So it is often confusing, but I do think there's this notion of perceived value of physical experiences versus digital experiences. And I think the ability to build community around digital experiences is going to be quite critical. So the beauty of the stadium experience is that you're sharing some physical space which is going to have digital value. I mean, you're going to take images, you're going to take videos, share it with your network. And there is a notion of exclusivity to that I did this when a bunch of other people wanted to and couldn't. It could be a concert, it could be a cricket match. We have not been able to build, I would say, unique, and I don't think they necessarily have to be exclusive, but value-add experiences in the digital space. But there are always some interesting projects. I've seen people, for example, take amateur sport and then videograph it and help people cut highlights and be able to build the social layer on stuff. So I think there is something to take away from these very real expressions of what is worth paying for, and then building businesses around making those viable in ways that may not be sort of the most linear way to commercialize a videography app, right? Or a analytics app. You would think that you should be delivering it to high performance athletes, but perhaps at the badminton players who are playing all over the country, can you build a product which they are able to value, pay for, and find social value in, not just sporting value? And building that in the same way social commerce has taken off, building, I would say, sports social commerce perhaps is a way to look at that, where it combines that the spectator in you, which wants to also brag to other people, but also the participant in you. I mean, you're a participant when you're going to watch a match as well, but a more active participant would be one who's actually playing the sport, sharing the joys of having played the sport physically, but also building new audiences for yourself. You may not be a top-class athlete, but there are audiences who care about you and your health and your social life and you being happy. So trying to build some of those strands out, I think there are some interesting strands to pull out.
For sure, I agree. I think the Strava for X, for those most listeners will be familiar with the Strava, which is the most popular, let's say, running or outdoor hiking activity app in the world. But you can build that for any sports vertical. India badminton is a great example. The number of people that play it. I was speaking with Megha, the founder of Stupa, on this podcast, and they have a wonderful product for table tennis, but they're targeting badminton because it is far outplayed compared to any other racket sport or most sports actually in India. Great example there. Nandan, thanks so much for sharing your insights. What is coming up? Maybe you can talk about what is coming up for you for the Sports and Society Accelerator, just generally over the next 12, 18 months. What's the outlook like for you and for Indian sports in general from your perspective?
Yeah, no, I'm excited about what's in store for Indian sport. There's, I would say, renewed drive, the intent to host the 2036 Olympics. Whether or not it happens, I think it's a great statement of intent, massive rhetoric value. It helps align the ecosystem, bring everyone onto at least a common page, which I think we've struggled with. So finding common alignment, it's an exciting time. At the Sports and Society Accelerator, we see that also is a massive opportunity, which is a lead-in to an Olympics hosting opportunity, but a lead-out as well. So the legacy of an event like that. And I don't think any Olympics is complete without a legacy plan, which is at population scale, changing the relationship that a country has with sport and physical activity. So that's a very exciting trend. And I think we're trying to find solutions now, Rohan, which are not necessarily trying to change the way people live or spread their time, but just changing the way they interact with the daily activities. So how do you make a school an active school, not just in physical activity, but in attitude? How do you get the attitudes of physical life and physical culture to seep into the DNA of a school? How about an active workplace? Are there ways in which to activate workplaces, have more walking meetings, have a different way that you would organize your space? And the same with how we look at cities and urban and rural spaces. How do you encourage more people to live active lives? And that in some sense becomes the foundation of a sports culture, which will bubble up organically into sports performance, into what I would call a demand-driven economy of sport, which allows so many more people to build entrepreneurial ventures, deliver value. But it has to come from all of us as consumers, as users of sport. And I think the time for a top-down model where the government delivers what it thinks is sport hopefully comes to an end. And we are the drivers of the sporting culture that we want, the physical culture that we require, and in some sense, the future that we all wish for together.
A wonderful sentiment. And actually one that I certainly echo, that this cultural change is starting to see the wheels moving in that direction, but it's important that it gathers some momentum. In fact, the statement that I make when it comes to the 2036 bid is that most Olympic bids are external signaling, like, hey, telling the world that here we're arrived, this is a topic we want to announce our country for on the sporting world. With India, it almost seems like this bid is internal signaling. It's just telling the nation that, hey, listen, we want to do this. We are positioning ourselves. Let's take sport more seriously. So really interesting move. Whether we succeed or not, it hopefully will create a lot of impact either way. Now, before I let you go, I have to ask my favorite question, which is always the one I end the podcast on. What has been your favorite sporting moment?
For me, I think of this often. It's the first time I ever played competitive sport. It was for the under-12s of my school hockey team. So the first time I ever played a competitive match is still sort of imprinted on my mind like a little bit of a film. So it just started a journey which I hope to continue as long as I possibly can. So it will remain my favorite sporting moment.
Brilliant. Any highlights? Did you score a goal? Did you smash somebody on their legs? Any fun action from that game that you remember?
I don't remember the details. I just remember the emotions. It actually plays like a little bit of a film, and I think just the excitement that brings to a young person, and I'd just love more people to experience the joy of something like that.
Fantastic. I remember when I think back to the school memories that we had playing sport in whatever small way that we did. Most of it was, we didn't play a lot of sport in India growing up. There wasn't a lot of organized tournaments and stuff. We played a few matches a year, but it was a camaraderie, that engagement with your friends and going out. And yeah, all of those, the emotional value was so powerful. And yeah, I just wish there are more and more people who experience that and more regularly, not just as one-offs. Brilliant. Nandan, thank you so much for taking the time, for sharing so much information, sharing your perspective on what is happening in Indian sports. You'll continue to do that in our report. We have a little bit piece from you. So thank you for your contribution there. So for anybody who wants to hear more from Nandan, check out our report. And also maybe the best way to get in touch with you is through LinkedIn or through your website, your email, if somebody wants to know more.
Absolutely, yeah. I think LinkedIn's a good place to find me.
Perfect. And go check out Nandan's LinkedIn profile. Also has details about the book if you want to get your hands on a copy. Great, Nandan, thanks for taking the time.
Thank you. Great chatting with you.
All right, that is a wrap for the first episode in our series on the Indian ecosystem, one which has a lot of momentum building, as you heard from Nandan, if you got the full episode. And as you'll hear from more guests coming up for you. See you guys next week. Cheers.
Thanks for listening to the Sports Tech Allstars Podcast with Rohan Malhotra. If you like our show, let us know and leave a review. And if you want to know more about us, check out sportstechx.com, where you can find our latest industry reports and updates. For a deeper dive into all things sports tech, check out our comprehensive database, Sports Tech DB, at sportstechdb.com. Don't forget to follow us on social media. You can find us at SportsTechX on Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook. Join us next time for another insightful conversation with a leader in sports tech.